Oh, hi. It's Grandpa Ricky. And I just woke up. Had a piece of peanut butter and garlic and banana and romaine lettuce toast. It was delicious. My sweetie's coming home today. It's going to be hard because we're going to have to take all kinds of precautions. So she doesn't bring back any virus if she can. It's an interesting time. My son observed today that he was feeling so grateful that he had not gone through much suffering in his life compared to people who've been refugees and displaced and wars and things like that. And I had to agree with him. Boy, I thought I had it bad, but it's nothing compared to other people. And other people's traumas are their traumas. And we're all learning to get by and have an easier life. I'm lying here in my wife's bed. We're fortunate enough that she has her own room, and I have my own room, and most of the time she lets me sleep in her bed with her. So I woke up and I had fear, and I lay there for a long time, maybe an hour, just being perfectly still and calming each of the tense muscles that I discovered. And I couldn't sleep, but I did start to think about childhood experiences I had. And so I'd like to take you on a journey with me that I had when I was a kid. I think I've talked about it in another video. My parents were having some kind of trouble, I don't know what. And they put me on a train to go to see my grandmother all alone with a tag on my coat. And it was, late winter, early spring. And the train had to back up. And it was pretty scary because, I was little and the seats were, it was a very old railroad car, and the seats had slats on them, wooden slats, and it was uncomfortable. I remember the steam coming as we walked towards the train, and I saw these, everything was just gigantic. I was little, everything else was big. And there was a wood stove in the railroad car. That's what heated it, along with the steam. And I don't know if that memories get confused with the streetcars in Toronto. When I was a kid, my parents didn't have a car or anything, so each streetcar had its own, it was electric, but it had its own wood stove in it. So the train started off from Union Station in Toronto and went up to a place called Barrie. And I was supposed to be taken off the train and put onto another train. And I was asleep and somebody forgot. And the train went ahead up. It was headed for Thunder Bay or Port Arthur, Port McNichol. No, Port Arthur and something else, I don't remember. It's now been called the Twin Cities. There are two cities, and they've got the one named Thunder Bay up in Lake Superior. And somebody discovered me and remembered, and then they backed the train up for a long time. And they had got word that I was coming through because my uncle worked for the post office, and his job was to be on this train. And he knew all the train people, and he'd set up that, people were going to look after me. And so the train to Victoria Harbour that met in, I think it was Barrie, waited for me. And they carried me out and put me on the other train, and then it went into Victoria Harbour. And Victoria Harbour was where my grandmother lived, where my mother had been born. And it was a tiny, tiny, tiny place. It had once been a big city because the whole town was owned by the Wally Furniture Company from Chicago. And all of the trees were being cut down to provide wood for furniture, and I think they sold wood. And the mill had stopped by that point, so there was just the equipment lying around that I'd seen earlier and saw later. And my grandmother met me at the train, and I remember being kind of half asleep and walking past these gigantic wheels on the train, on the engine of the train. And it was quite a moment, and she carried my little bag, and we walked up and past the government dock, and the old hotel that was, I think, still going, but still almost out of business. And we walked past the general store that I had very good associations with because my mother would take me there and my grandmother would take me there, and the store owners would give me a piece of candy or something like that. And this was during World War II, so everything was in short supply. And we kept walking up through the town, the main street. We passed the post office. It was a tiny little building. We passed my aunt's house, and her daughter had just died. She died on the operating table, getting her tonsils taken out. And she was grieving, and so was her husband, who was a sailor on a boat that carried passengers and freight and things like that up to Thunder Bay through Sault Ste. Marie. And as I passed the house, I knew that Beryl, her daughter, and my uncle's daughter had died. And I remember feeling the pain that was coming out of that house. It was palpable. And we kept walking a short distance, and then we turned in through my grandmother's gate. And this was a kind of a pretty amazing house, and it had belonged to my grandfather's mother, and she had used it as a bake shop. And it had been close up to the boardwalk. There wasn't a cement step yet. There was this very old boardwalk that was having trouble because the lumber mill had closed. It was made of wood. And I remember going into the house and how wonderful it smelled of beef stew and fresh bread and cookies. And my grandmother's brothers owned farms around Victoria Harbour, so they would sneak her meat. And because the government was controlling all of the food because they had to send food to the First World War fighting in England and France and all those countries. And I remember going into the kitchen at the back of the house that my grandfather had added to the house, and I saw this stove, big, huge wood stove with a warm fire going, and this pot of stew shoved to the side and off the direct heat. And my grandmother gave me food, and I remember being hungry and tasting it. It was so good. And then I found out later, a few years later, that my mother had been kept alive in that stove. And the story was that when my grandmother was pregnant with my mother, their house was still up close to the street, and I had one uncle and two aunts that were born before my mother, and so they needed to make the house bigger. And what my grandfather did was he jacked the whole house up and then lowered the house on these big logs. And the idea was that he was going to drag the house back from the street. And they had taped up all the windows and everything was ready. And it started, and my grandmother had forgotten something for the children in these closets that were, from the ceiling, and it was kind of a triangular closet. And she had gone back into the house and not told her husband that she was there. And she'd gone into one of these closets, and as the horses started, the whole house shifted and creaked and everything, and the door closed and it locked. And so my grandmother was locked in this completely dark closet and terrified because the sound was very loud and the weight of the house sliding. It was a two-story house. The weight of the house sliding on the wood that had been carefully greased with fat and things like that. And the horses were straining, and the workers were yelling, and there was pandemonium. And she started to scream, but no one could hear her for all of these sounds. And so she gave birth to my mother in the dark in this closet with all these sounds going on. And I don't know how many months premature my mother was, but when she was discovered and they found the baby, they didn't know what to do. So it was in August. It was very warm, and they took a pan used for baking turkeys, and they got the wood stove going that was still there when I visited my grandmother in the story. And they put a big pan of water on one rack, and then on the next rack they put this bedpan, or this not bedpan, this, which is what you use in the hospital when you have to go to the toilet and you can't go to the toilet, so they give you a pan. So here's my mother in flannel with a sheet over her, and they put her in the oven and then partially closed the door so that it was damp and warm and dark and quiet. And my mother lived. They were feeding her with an eyedropper. And it scared my mother. When I was born, she was very terrified of giving birth. Because now I find I know now that her body had memory of her being born. And I hope someday you get to relive your birth emotionally and physically. It's quite a powerful healing experience. And you need help to do it. You can't do it alone. And so I was put to bed in this room, and the house smelled of roses and lavender and all the things that my grandmother used. And her husband, my grandfather, had died, I guess about 10 years before this story. And she was still grieving. She was a really very taciturn Scottish lady, put on a happy face, don't talk about your pain and suffering, and always put other people before yourself. And my grandmother was revered in this town because in many ways she was a mystic. She'd had a terrible time as a kid. Her parents had died. Her father had married somebody who didn't like her. And they had been kicked out of where they lived in Scotland. And somebody took pity on them and gave them some money to buy some land in Canada. And when she was 18 years old, she came over to Canada in a sailing ship, which was the cheapest way to get to Canada, even though there were steam-driven boats and things. And she had to walk 122 miles behind an ox cart, pulling all of their possessions from Scotland. And she was a pioneer kid, They lived in a 9x9 room with a whole pile of kids, and they were kept warm by the heat of the animals that were in this tiny little structure, these two oxen. And so she woke me up in the morning and gave me breakfast, and I couldn't sleep much. I still remember not being able to sleep when I was there, even though I didn't feel safe. I missed my mother and father, even though I didn't like them, and they scared me. And then my grandmother started telling me stories about my mother and took me for walks in the woods and taught me how to help her to chop vegetables and eat more of this stew that she had prepared. And day after day after day went on, and I got very homesick and very lonely. And she took me into her tiny little bed that was kind of tucked under the eaves. It had been part of the addition that my grandfather had added to this house. He also built a woodshed. And she would take me out to gather water. There was a hand pump with these wonderful tasting water. I still remember it. And there were hollyhocks growing in the garden, and then there was a big, huge room at the back of the house behind the kitchen, and it was filled with wood. And my grandmother's brothers had brought the wood, and it was all carefully stacked. A whole winter's worth of wood was carefully stacked in that room. And I remember going out. There was an outhouse, and an outhouse is like a little tiny house way back from the main house. Has a door on it, and it had a wooden seat with a hole in it, and you went to the toilet into the hole, and then there were buckets beside the hole inside the toilet, one of ashes and one of sawdust. And oh boy, the memories coming back of all this right now. It's really something to remember. I went down after a while. My grandmother was in the outhouse, and there was no toilet paper. There was just pieces of newspaper. And my grandmother had helped me, and I learned how to tear squares of newspaper and to use as toilet paper. And my grandmother was in the outhouse, and I went down and I locked her in. And she was very calm about it, and she was talking to me, and I actually wandered away, and she kept talking to me, and she had learned to trust life. And I think that she knew how to talk to angels, because she convinced me to open up the door, and by promising to get me some cookies. And so a couple of days later, I was walking to the outhouse, and I fell in the woodshed, and I cut the bottom of my chin, and it was a huge, huge gash, and there was blood all over the place. And the nearest doctor was about 20, 30 miles away. She had a telephone, but she didn't know anybody who had a car, and she thought, I think I can do this. So she set up some food and taught me how to hold my skin together. She had it bandaged, and then she took me into her lap, and she rocked me in a rocking chair. It was a rocking chair that my grandfather had purchased for her. And we looked out the window, and she told me stories and sang me songs. And she sat there for, I don't know how long. I mean, I kept falling asleep, and then I'd wake up and I'd cry, and she would just rock me and sing to me, hold me in her lap. And I got so lonely one night. She took me into her bed, and I found out for the first time that she had very long hair. It was going gray, but she always tied her hair up in a braid, and then she coiled the braid around. Her hair would be parted in the middle, and her hair would be in a little ball at the back of her neck. And she would sing to me at night. And we had, even though it was August, we had flannel sheets, and the nights were cold because it was in northern, 100 miles from Toronto. So I'm very grateful to have had my grandmother in my life. And she died when I was 9 years old or something, and my parents didn't want to traumatize me, so they didn't let me come to the funeral, and I think that was more traumatizing, and I missed her. I still miss her. And her name was Jenny. Their name was Jenny Groves, and she married my grandfather, and his name was Burns. And I stayed with my grandfather for a long time. Or my grandmother for a long time. I don't remember how long. But I got to be able to go down to the general store. I'd go down to the drugstore even, and cross the road and go and pick the mail up. And I was taken to where my mother worked as a telephone operator after World War I. And I went to visit my Aunt Marjorie and saw how she'd kept all of Beryl's things exactly where they were when she died. And there was this very strange thing that I knew that my aunt was pretending to be happy but was very sad inside. And I could feel her pain. And my grandmother was tuned into me, and she talked about the fact that my Aunt Marjorie was suffering. And by her talking about it, acknowledging that that was painful, it really helped me a lot. And it also helped me that my grandmother said, and she will get over this. And it took my Aunt Marjorie, I guess, another 20 years. And she had developed this whole pretend parts of herself that she presented to the public, and then privately she was very, very sad, and so was her husband, Gordon. And so eventually it came time to go home, and my Uncle Oliver and my Aunt Gladys, uh, they drove up from Toronto in a car. He was the guy who worked for the post office, and he also sold eggs. And he was a very good, hardworking guy who was very healthy, and and he was very, very, very careful. And so he had this old car, and he drove the old car up, and they got me and took me back to Toronto. And he had three daughters, and they were in the car too. There was Gwen and Mary and Barbara, and he was a very happy, funny guy. And he brought out the happiness and funniness. And Gladys was a nurse, and she'd been there when Beryl had died and when I was born. My mother died when I was born, and she came back to life. And she later told me that I had ruined her. She'd had to have a hysterectomy because I had such big shoulders and I was such a big, healthy baby. She didn't know how much that hurt and confused me. She was doing her best, like everybody's doing their best, and now I'm compassionate. Maybe make a video about how I got to be compassionate. And I think the biggest way was to accept the fact that I was suffering, that things happened to me that really hurt me and confused me and messed me up, and I was embarrassed about that. So I was always trying, like Aunt Marjorie, to pretend that everything was okay. And I was a faker, but I faked things long enough that I learned when I actually got down in therapy and these other healing experiences I've been doing all my life, I was able to acknowledge that I'd suffered. I wasn't afraid of being afraid. I wasn't afraid of feeling my emotions or letting other people know what my emotions are, and we all have to do that. I learned recently this idea that we have to be soft on soft-bellied and vulnerable, but we also have to have a strong back and be strong. And my grandmother taught me that. My mother taught me that. In retrospect, I didn't like her. I didn't trust her because she had disappeared. And I didn't really tune into her. She didn't really tune into me. I think she did, but I couldn't feel it because I didn't trust her. And my dad was a guy who had a lot of problems. He was healing from his childhood all his life. When he died, my mother said to me, well, I think I saved him. And I think she did, you know. So I hope you've enjoyed this long ramble about Victoria Harbour. And there's a funny side note, and that was my grandmother, when I was there as this little tiny kid, she gave me a 22 rifle, and she taught me how to shoot. So, and it was a tiny, tiny, it was a kid's 22. That you could buy them, anybody could buy them in the Eaton's catalog. And she had bought this gun for my uncle, who was younger than my mother. And that was kind of strange because her oldest son, his name was Wallace, and he was killed in World War One. And yet, you know, she was a pioneer girl. She'd grown up in the country in Scotland, and you know, had a hard life as a pioneer. Uh, but she felt it was important for kids to learn how to shoot guns. So here's this little kid with this tiny little rifle. The rifle was like, you know, well, maybe 2 feet long, but it shot 22s. And I've loved guns ever since, and I've got great respect for them because I still remember what she taught me about how to carry it and how to be careful and all those kinds of things. So I'm about ready to go to sleep now. I hope you've enjoyed this story. It's been long and rambly. My God, it's half an hour long. But anyway, thank you for listening or for watching, and I hope this story has been of some use to you, because I think we have to tell each other our stories so that what's happened in our lives maybe can be useful to somebody else. Maybe we'll get some snippet of an idea that will grow in us. And it's really helped me to talk about this stuff because, you know, I'm 82 and I know that I'll die at some point soon, I suspect, but hopefully not for a long time, because I love my life now, and I think I finally learned to be a nice guy. Please tell your story. Your stories are as important as my stories. You may not think they're interesting, but it's a really good idea to be soft on the outside and strong on the inside. Okay? Tell your stories. And please let me know about it. Someday I'll have a website and I'll tell people about your stories. Okay? Thank you very much.